Hey guys, welcome to round two. Real quick before we get into the games in our game, so my game against subscribers, in the comments section, you guys suggested the move c4 and I responded with g6. So it is your move again, and good luck. All right, guys, round two of the candidates happened earlier today. Let's take a look at one of the most interesting games, in my opinion, Rapport against Firouzja. Let's go. So e4, c5. And after d4, which this is very standard, but almost everyone takes with the knight. Okay, queen takes d4 is a very different type of move because most likely black's going to play knight c6 and either chase away your queen and you lose some time, or you have to be willing to play bishop to b5 and trade your bishop for the knight. And so after this happens, we actually transpose into a bishop b5 Sicilian, which is funny because I like playing bishop b5 Sicilian, but normally it happens where I'll play bishop b5 first, you know, black will maybe block with the knight, and then I'll play d4, and sometimes I will capture with the queen and get this exact same position. So I'm kind of familiar with this. Now, after the trade, normally when I play this, I will just develop quickly, something like this, bring the bishop out to g5. Richard goes for c4, which is called the Maroczy bind setup, where you put your pawns on c4 and e4, and you're really trying to clamp down on the d5 square and make it more difficult for black to play d5. I mean, if they really want to, they can usually get enough pieces supporting it, but it does kind of slow it down. So that's the idea. c4, e5, pretty common. You're just, you know, creating that strong pawn in the center, chasing away the queen. The downside of this move is usually this d6 pawn now can become a target. So sometimes white can bring a rook to d1. Sometimes even the bishop can come over here, and you have to be careful that you don't lose the pawn on d6. Queen goes back. Knight here, the knight's going to jump around here, potentially go to f4, and Richard plays c5. It's a little temporary pawn sacrifice, but if black decides to take this, well, just look at black's pawns. And actually, it's not really a sacrifice because e5 is hanging now that I'm looking at the position, so you can't really take it. That just makes no sense. So knight to g6, we get the trade, and black has the bishop pair, but they do have these isolated pawns, and so it's kind of a trade-off, relatively equal position. So the game goes on, and right around here, it really was kind of looking very drawish. Like, you've got extremely even position. Stockfish says just 0-0. Nobody really has an advantage. And especially once these pieces started getting traded off, it was just looking like a draw. And then let's just jump ahead. There's something very interesting that happened. So the rooks stay on the board. Rook gets to the 7th rank. Now that's the start of something interesting, but usually one rook on the 7th isn't quite enough to be super dangerous, okay? But as the game goes on, we get knight to d4, which is a very strong knight. If white doesn't take that, that knight's just going to sit there and kind of control the game. And so white really has to take that. And right around here looks very drawish, and then boom. Firouzja plays this move, which Stockfish says is a blunder because that rook was protecting this pawn. And, if black doesn't do this, just any move like h5 or h6 or, I don't know, anything almost, it's going to be pretty difficult for white to figure out a way to make progress. I mean, yes, you have this rook here, which is nice, but like I said, one rook usually isn't enough. But as soon as you play this move, now it gives white kind of this clear idea of like taking the pawn and getting both rooks on the 7th rank. Okay, and that's exactly what happens. Takes, the rook comes over, and here we go, rook to c7. Now, there's a term in chess called pigs on the 7th, when you get two rooks like this on the 7th rank. And it's because once you get rooks like that connected, they can usually just start taking stuff, right? You can see like white's just threatening to take both of the pawns. A lot of times it's very dangerous. You can get checkmate. And so kind of a weird move initially. I guess you could say that Firouzja was getting a little bit lower on time. So maybe that had something to do with it. But I mean, I don't know. So anyway, we get this position. There is this, capture where the H-pawn is defended. So it's not like completely losing immediately for black, but it's definitely not a good position. All right. So here we go, G6. And Stockfish found this super crazy line, which is, I analyzed it. It's like, let's see. Yeah, it's like 16 moves deep, where it starts with check. And I'll go ahead and show it to you. So rook G7 check. The king has to go in the corner. If the king tried to come here, now you can push E5. And after takes, this pawn is coming up and the king is coming up. And you know, black's probably going to get checkmated. So as an example, rook to f2, you can take here, threatening checkmate. King has to like move to try to be able to block, and now the pawn comes up and black is completely losing. Okay, the king is going to come up and eventually you're going to have some big checkmate problems. So black would have to go to the corner, and then we get this super long line which basically revolves around pushing this b pawn. And I'll just show it to you. Rook h3, you block temporarily because after this you want to be able to capture this pawn, so we get this trade of rooks. And then here we go, the king is going to help the pawn. Now it's interesting because watch what happens. H5, E5. And this is the line that Stockfish found. Of course, I didn't see any of this myself, obviously. You get this really interesting thing where black ends up sacrificing their rook for the two pawns. Okay, so you get takes, queen, and you get this position. Now, this is, like I said, like 16 moves into the future, you'd have to see this position. And then even if you were able to see all of that, you'd have to figure out, okay, who's winning and who's, you know, losing and what's going on in this position. Because normally you would say, well, the rook is winning because the rook's going to take the pawns. But in this case, they're both connected and the king is kind of close. So you have to analyze, like, what happens if black pushes here, you try to attack that and they defend? Or what if they just start bringing their king up and try to use their king to push the pawn? Can your, you know, king and rook stop these pawns in time? Stockfish says ultimately, yes, they can, but it's not that easy. And so, but anyway, that was kind of the winning line for white if you were able to calculate all of that. But in the game, what was played was e5, which Stockfish doesn't like nearly as much. So we get this position. It's still very interesting. Rook to h3, trying to create some counterplay here. The king is coming up, and ideally, you know, what Richard would like to do is bring the king up to like one of these squares and then checkmate the king. The problem is black's rook over here is going to keep checking the king or potentially prevent that from happening. Okay, so as an example, this is played, and rook to e3. So like, let's just say we tried to run with the king now. Well, black's going to be able to take here with check, and it almost looks like, hey, I'm about to get checkmate, but there's this amazing move, rook to h5. And the point is, the rook is actually defending the threat, and it's defended by the pawn. And so if you take the pawn, then there's going to be, this is actually losing for white because of this little tactic where you lose your rook. So you can't do that. And the checkmate doesn't actually work because now the rook is guarding h8, right? So it's not that simple. Even though it definitely looks better for white, it's still kind of a question of how do you proceed, okay? So what was played in the game was check, check. They did a little dance, almost looked like it was going to be a repetition, and then Richard wisely, I think, you know, didn't go for the draw because clearly this is better for white, and then captured this pawn. All right, now this position actually looks extremely scary if you're playing black because your king is completely cut off, you're stuck in the corner, and it almost looks like you're about to get checkmated. The problem that white has is you need another piece to deliver the checkmate, right? Your rooks are already kind of busy, and your king obviously can't deliver the checkmate, and your pawns, I mean, how are they going to become a queen when black has rooks that are going to be doing things? And black has a pawn that, if you let it, in 3 moves is going to be a queen. The rook comes down. White tries to push. Rook comes over. Now you have 2 rooks attacking your pawn. So check. Check. Rook here to defend. And this was actually a big mistake. So rook to e7 is actually a big blunder, but it's super, super, super difficult to see why. And, you know, some people in the chat and the game after Richard played b4 were like, oh, no, how could you blunder? You know, how did you not see the win? Well, let me just say, these rook endings, especially when there's like a couple of pawns and double rooks, these are some of the most difficult positions in chess, period, which is weird because there are only a few pieces left. You'd think that it wouldn't be that complicated, but it's actually extremely difficult to figure out what's going on. And just to give you an example, the winning line here was king to f5. And then, for example, there's so many things black can do. Let's say black tries to put you in check. You're going to run over this way. It puts you in check. You're going to run over to d6. And now you're attacking the rook and you can get ready to use your king to help support the pawn as it pushes forward. Okay, so that's kind of one idea. But let's just say black plays d3 instead, trying to push their pawn. Now the point was you were going to play rook to g1. all the way back here. And what's the point? Well, you're trying to set up some kind of mating threat over here. Okay, so for example, like let's say d2, you're going to play rook h1 check, and if the king moves here, well, now it's just checkmate. Okay, like this. That's kind of one idea. But the king can move here, in which case now the rook can block, so it's not going to be the same checkmate. So now you have to play rook f to h6, doubling up over here, threatening to come down here with another checkmate. So for example, let's just say black got a queen. You could do this, checkmate, right? So that's kind of one idea. So black would have to play the move rook to f2 check. And now your king runs this way, like we already saw, over to d6. And again, you're kind of putting black in a tough spot. So rook h7 is the move that has to be played. You don't take it, because if you take it, black has, let's see, rook to e1. And I'm just trying to kind of show you guys like how complicated this position is. Like I'm using the engine to tell you all of these exact precise moves, but these guys don't have the engine. They have to figure out all of this over the board with like a couple minutes left on the clock, right? So, and this is just one of the lines that you would have to calculate, right? So there's a lot of other things black could play. They didn't have to push the pawn. They didn't have to go check. They could make some other moves. And so, you know, when somebody says, oh, they just blundered, well, this is not a blunder. This is, okay, you didn't find the super complicated winning line. Not the same thing as a blunder. Anyway, b4 is played. And after d3, the rook comes back. We get this trade. And we end up with a drawn rook ending. Now, let me just explain. Some people might see, well, you know, look at this and say, well, hold on a second. White has an extra pawn. Can't you use that pawn to somehow win the game? The problem is that white's king can't help the pawn. Okay, normally this is good news. You've got your rook kind of cutting off your opponent's king, and you would ideally like to use your king to help your pawn over here and go get a queen. But your king is cut off too. And so you can't really do that, okay? So king f6, and let's just say, for example, you tried to put your rook behind the pawn and push it. Well, black can simply go king f5. Let's say you push it, blockade it with the rook. And the question is, how are you going to make progress? Because every time you try to bring your king over, black's going to bring their king over, right? And they're boxing you out. You can't really get through. And eventually they're going to just take your pawn, right? And so it's a table-based draw, which means there's no possible way to win unless black were to make some sort of big mistake. And so the game ended in a draw. Unfortunately, I know I said I wasn't going to show you draws, but this one was really interesting with the double rooks on the 7th rank, and definitely had a lot of winning chances for white, but they were not easy to see. All right, next game, Nakamura, Radjabov. Here we go. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, and this is the exact same opening that we have seen before. Ruy Lopez with the Berlin, okay? And again, like I said, the main line is, castling, the knight takes, you play d4 and blah, 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 but d3 is played yet again. So people are kind of avoiding that because it's so solid for black. Usually it's white that's kind of changing it up. So d3, bishop c5. Knight b to d2 is not one of the most common moves. It's kind of more of a sideline. The more common moves would be c3 and bishop takes c6. Those are played much more often than even just castling. So knight b to d2, we start to enter territory that is less familiar. Knight to d4 is one of the lines. Trading c3, you do gain a tempo on the bishop. And now Hikaru plays d4, just getting control of the center. This is why you play c3 most of the time, so that you can support d4. And if you're asking yourself, well, can't black just take that and win a pawn? Takes, takes, takes. White has the move knight to f3, so it's kind of like a pawn sacrifice. But after the bishop moves, you can follow it up with e5, and you're actually getting a really nice attack on black. So for example, let's just say the knight try to move over here. You simply castle, and black has to be very careful that this knight doesn't get trapped, like with h3. There is a move queen e7, and I guess black can play on, but just as an example, if you were to castle h3, where's the knight going to go? h6, and then this looks pretty bad. Actually, Stockfish has a bishop g5 first, and then not even taking it, just playing queen c2. Very, very good position for white. So the point that I was trying to make is, yes, you can take the pawn if you want, but after knight f3, you got to move your bishop, then e5, you got to move your knight, white castles, and all of a sudden, white gets a very nice attack on your king. And so usually it's, you know, maybe not worth it. And so black plays c6. And one thing to point out here, Radjabov used quite a bit of time. So if you check his time right here, from 149 to 128, that's a long time to think this early in the game. We're on move 8. A lot of these guys have prepared these opening lines, you know, much further than 8 moves. And so maybe he wasn't comfortable with this line, this knight b to d2 line, or I'm not sure what was going on there, but that's a lot of time to use. So anyway, we get sort of the main line here: white castles, black castles, queen to h5. As far as I know, this hasn't been played before. I mean, it's kind of a logical move, just attacking the pawn, and also potentially you're thinking about bringing the knight over to attack on the king side. Queen to c6 defends the pawn. Rook to e1, rook to e8, knight to f3. And so now, like I said, knight to g5 is a very real threat that black has to sort of watch out for. Okay, so for example, if black tries to take this pawn, it's actually completely losing because of bishop to f4. And the point is, white is threatening to take your rook and then kind of follow it up with rook e1, and then there's a checkmate back here. And if black just sort of tries to take and then play like a, I don't know, normal looking move like d5, knight to g5, and there's too many threats that black just can't deal with. You can't use your queen to help because the rook is threatening checkmate if you move it, and you just can't deal with everything. So that's kind of why black shouldn't take the pawn, and they didn't. Now, this is a good learning opportunity. Sometimes in chess, you're in a rough position, like we could say black maybe is in a tough position here. Sometimes what you can do is sacrifice a pawn to sort of free up your position, open up some pieces, kind of change the dynamic of the position. And even though you lose a pawn, a lot of times it's the best decision. And that's exactly what happens here. Black plays the move d5. And if you notice, it's a pawn sacrifice, right? White can just take it and win a pawn, but it does open up black's bishop and kind of changes the dynamic of the position. And so that's exactly what happens. White captures, we get this rook trade, the queen comes in, and now all of a sudden, you know, white has to be careful because white's still not developed, and black's getting ready to kind of bring this bishop out. So h3 prevents that move, and also gives the king an escape in case there's any ideas of back rank checkmates in the future. Bishop to d7, and I want to go ahead and get forward a little bit to this endgame. So queen to d5 offers the queen trade. Hikaru does allow the queen trade, and we get this position right here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 against black's 6 pawns. So 6 pawns, a rook, a knight against the bishop. Extremely equal. Stockfish says it's just dead equal. But it goes to show, as you're going to see over the course of this game, that things can change, especially in these endgames where you have to be extremely accurate, okay? And this is one of the, at least for me, this is one of the most difficult parts of chess. When you get to these endgames that are supposed to be equal, but you really have to understand everything that's going on. Otherwise, it can get away from you, all right? So I'm going to go kind of quickly through this, but what I want you to notice is Hikaru allows his pawn to be traded because now his rook is very active and attacking all sorts of stuff in black's camp. And also, he ends up getting this nice outpost for his knight. And we've seen this before earlier in one of the other games I showed you, where a knight was on an outpost and it pretty much controlled the game. This knight on d4 is a monster. It's defended by the pawn. It's on an opposite color of the bishop. So the bishop's not going to be able to attack it. And it's just going to sit there for as long as it needs to and just kind of control all this stuff in the center of the board. Very, very powerful, right? So when you guys have knights, look for places like this where no pawns can attack it and just defend it with the pawn and just leave it sit there, okay? As close to the center of the board as you can. And it's a very good strategy. Now, that being said, Stockfish thinks the position is still pretty equal. But slowly and surely, as the game goes on, Hikaru manages to create a very nice position. And so part of this had to do with the time. So right around, yeah, right here, this is move 35, okay? And Radjabov still has to get to move 40. And notice his clock is at 3 minutes. Okay, so that's not a lot of time. And then here, 1 minute left and still has to make, let's see, 4 more moves, okay? So that probably had something to do with it. The position was very equal. And then over these next couple of moves, here we go. Rook takes a6, the trade here. And now Hikaru plays rook to d6, a very tricky move because black has to decide which way do I put the bishop, or even do I even go back? You could go to bishop to g4, which Stockfish thinks was the best choice. But you notice the clock, 15 seconds. So Radjabov has to decide basically immediately, or he will just lose on time. I was watching the game and he thought down to 2 seconds left on the clock before he played his move. So pretty tense moment, to say the least. He chose bishop c8, which is not the correct move. Like I said, Stockfish really likes bishop to g4 here, which is a weird looking move because you're blocking your own rook from taking the pawn. And I'm not going to get into all the details of going down the rabbit trail of why Stockfish likes that move. But bishop c8 was played, and that's the time control. So now he gets an extra hour and can kind of think about the position. But now Hikaru manages to eventually, it doesn't happen right away, but eventually manages to trade this pawn. And he kind of dances around for a while, and finally now they trade pawns. And so we get this interesting position where white has 3 pawns over here, 3 passed pawns, and black has 2 over here, which are not as pretty because they're not connected. But black does have the bishop. One of the things about the bishop at the end of the game like this is the bishop is very good at controlling both sides of the board. So black can potentially use the bishop to help prevent these pawns from pushing, and also maybe support somewhere along, you know, this diagonal or this diagonal, support these guys pushing down. Now, that being said, white has a very nice thing going for them in this position, and that's the fact that white's king is in a great position to stop these pawns, right? Very easy to move our king somewhere over here and slow down these pawns, whereas look at black's king, not even close to stopping these pawns. So because of that, this is kind of better for white. It's just a question of what's going to happen as the game goes on. So knight to d4, again, centralizing the knight, defending it with the pawn, getting out of the way so that the pawns can just push. The rook comes down, the king goes over. c4, so there was a threat here by black to fork these pawns, or to fork king the pawn. And so c4, a nice way to defend that, because now the knight is defending the b pawn. This is already defended by the rook, and now the rook's defended, so you can actually move your knight somewhere and there's no more pin. So really nice move, c4. So here we go, game goes on, and here we can see white's king in action blockading black's pawns, right? Which black can't do because it's too far from these guys. So bishop d7 is still a tricky position, but it's slowly but surely, you know, white's advantage is increasing. All right. And now Hikaru plays king to g2, which according to the engine was a mistake. I can't, to be honest with you, figure out why. I was looking even with the engine, and I'm not sure I'm understanding what the reason is. The engine says you have to move the king to the f file to keep your advantage. King to g2 apparently loses the advantage. The line that is giving is rook to b1, a5, king to g5, a6, rook to a1, king to f2 now, king to f4. And I'm not sure like what the deal was. It almost looks like following this line of play, you sort of are going to want your king to actually come over here and help out this knight and pawn, but because you kind of wasted a move, it's a little bit too far. Like if you imagine if the king was already over here, you could kind of come up and do something like this, I guess is the idea. And you don't really need the king to stay over here because you can use your rook if you need to kind of stop that. I guess maybe that's the idea. I'm not actually entirely sure, but Stockfish did not like the move king to g2. Now, as soon as Radjabov plays rook c1, Stockfish is like, oh, that was not the right move. You needed your rook to be on b1. And so this kind of goes back to what I was saying. These endgames are extremely difficult to play. Like there's so many subtle things of like, you have to play the right move. Like Stockfish says rook c1 is losing, rook d1 is losing, rook a1 is losing, but rook b1 is fine. And how do you figure that out, you know, in the game? I mean, it's incredibly difficult. So anyway, rook to c1 is played, a5. So here goes the pawn, king to h5. And now the king kind of comes this way, which I guess makes sense, you know, going back what Stockfish was saying, like, hey, you should have put your king on the f file to begin with. It's going to be one move closer. King to g4. h3 is not... Stockfish doesn't like this sacrifice. Now, you have to realize Radjabov has 3 minutes and 55 seconds at this point, so the time is starting to become an issue. Now, there is increment, but still... 30 seconds is not a lot of time to figure out this incredibly complicated endgame. So he goes for the piece sacrifice. Rook takes h2, and the point is he would like to obviously get a queen, force Hikaru to sacrifice, and then try to stop the pawns with the rook. And if Hikaru would have went for that line, so by playing, let's just say rook h7, allowing the queen, sacrificing the rook, then playing b4 to try to push the pawns, maybe black actually does have some chances here. King to f4, the king's going to come back over, the rook's going to get behind the pawns, and it's still kind of a tricky position. I think white is still going to be able to win, but it's not going to be that easy. But Hikaru finds this very nice move, rook to g7 check. And the point is that if black moves over here somewhere, he's going to be able to play that move with check, which kind of buys white an extra move and also just wins the pawn now that I'm looking at it. And so black can't go over to the h-file, which means the knight's taking away these squares. You have to go to f4, which allows this knight fork. Now, even though it's a knight fork, you don't want to take the rook because black gets a queen, right? And then probably, I don't know what's going to happen, but there's the idea of knight to g3. And now you can sacrifice not your rook, but your knight for the pawn, which is obviously much better. You have a rook and you still have 3 pawns over here that are ready to go. All right. So nice find there. Rook check, the king goes up, rook check, king goes back. Hikaru does lose the b pawn, but this guy is going, it's almost, all the way. And now Hikaru gets to keep the knight. All right. So a7 is played, king to d4. And now I invite you to pause the video if you haven't already seen this and try to figure out what's the winning idea for white here. Because yes, you have the pawn advance, which is nice. Yes, you have the extra knight, but how do you actually capitalize and win? And keep in mind, black's plan is going to be to take this pawn, come over here, and then take your other pawn, in which case it's going to be a draw. So what should the winning plan be after black's move king to d4? Well, if you didn't already see the game, the answer is you need to bring your knight over to the action. Okay, and a point that's important here is that you can move this knight away and you don't need to worry about this pawn anymore. Even if black tries to bring the rook down, you can always just take it with your king first, or even if they put you in check, you can blockade it with your king, and if the rook comes down, you can always just take this pawn. So you don't actually need the knight to stop this anymore. Okay, so because of that, you need to start using the knight. You need to figure out the way to use the knight to help your rook and ultimately get the queen and force the rook to capture. So Hikaru does this perfectly. Knight to f5 check. Rook to b7 is important because you want to cut off the king so that it can't go there and take your pawn. It's going for c6 to try to make you move the rook, and so knight to e7 is an important move. And here the game was over. Black resigned, and the point is that it doesn't really matter what black does. Let's say they can throw in this check. You're going to go here, and let's just say they push the pawn. You're going to simply play knight to c8, and this is kind of the setup where now you can bring your rook down, and next move you're getting a queen. You have it defended by the knight, and black can't really do anything. You just get the queen. They have to sacrifice it, and you have your rook and your knight against 2 pawns. It's an easy win for white. So a really nice finish by Hikaru there to come back from the loss and win his next game. And yeah, pretty instructive endgame as well. So it just goes to show that, like, going way, way, way back here, when you have these positions where both sides have passed pawns, one of the sort of key factors is whose king is able to blockade those pawns. White's pawns, black's king couldn't stop them. Black's pawns, white's king could stop them, and eventually that led to the victory for Hikaru. So nice game there. Thankfully, not all of the games were draws. If we jump over real quick, Jan's game and Fabiano's was kind of an interesting game. I'm not going to go through it because it did just end in a repetition, a draw. But so both of those players are in the lead, and then also Duda and Ding was a draw as well. Here's the final position. Again, it was repetition over here as well. So back and forth, back and forth. All right, that's what I've got for you guys, and I will see you in round 3.